David, my understanding is that there was some concern on some part of people in NBC when you and Huntley first started working together that you might be too boring, and some things were suggested.
That was Davidson Taylor, who was a vice president in charge of Lord knew what. I didn't know then, and I don't know now. And he decided the two of them would spend the airtime reciting boring statistics and ball scores and politicians' names and stuff that nobody really cared about. Why he thought that, I don't know. And why he was in that job, I don't know. But in any case, he had the job, and he decided we needed somehow to be livened up starting this new program. He called on, I think they hired him just then, a man named Barry Wood, who was a singer. He used to sing on the Lucky Strike hit parade. He had one big hit, and it was called, during the war, called Any Bonds Today? Nobody will remember it. It was a lousy song. Anyway, he said meet him in someplace in the RCA building, and he had some blazers he wanted us to try on. They were brightly colored. One was red and one was orange or yellow, as I recall. And the NBC chimes embroidered on the pocket. I took one look at it and said, I will not wear it. Huntley said, I will not wear it. And I figured if we wore it, starting this new program, every news anchor person until time immemorial would have to go on there wearing something that looked like an animal trainer. And so we killed off Barry Wood and we killed off the blazers. So now we wear blue suits.
Well, speaking of animal training and animals, I understand you also had an episode with film that...
Oh, I did, yeah. Well, I was doing a 5-minute quote-unquote news program on the local Washington station only, and I believe it's 6 o'clock in the evening. We had one cameraman, period, no sound, and his name is George Johnson. During the day, he ran all around Washington with a wind-up camera called a Filmo, made by Bell and Howell. And he would come in about 4 o'clock with a little roll of film, which he said was news he had covered during the day. And needless to say, it was not very well done. He had no help. He was totally alone. Drove his own car and so on. And on this one day, he brought in 4 little stories. The first was the burial ceremony in Arlington Cemetery for some departed dignitary. I don't know who it was. The second and third stories, I don't remember. The fourth and last was from the Agriculture Department place outside of Washington, an experimental farm, where they were doing some kind of work with sheep. I never knew what it was. And those were the 4 stories. And we got into the studio at 6 o'clock, no rehearsal, of course, not possible. And the engineers had threaded the film in the projector backward. In those years, there were 2 rows of sprocket holes in film. Now there's only one. 2 rows of sprocket holes. So it'll go in either way. It would top up or top down. He put it backward. So he put on a little music, blah, 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 and up came the picture. The first picture, a sheep upside down. Now, you're so damn smart. Tell me what you would say sitting there with no information, no nothing. What did you say? What would you say? What could I say? What was there to say? I didn't know what the sheep was about. I didn't know why it was upside down.
You knew it was upside down, but...
I knew it was upside down. That's all I knew. So I just had to let it run, saying nothing. And for weeks after that, people shouted at me in the street, "You ever get that sheep back on its feet?"
The trials and tribulations of
early television.
Of
it was
live
funny.
television, of live television. Let's talk about David Brinkley's journal in the early 1960s. How did you come to do David Brinkley's journal?
Well, I had to do something, and we had all this elaborate machinery, television machinery available, nobody making much use of it. And I think it was my idea, good or bad, to, and I did invent this, the magazine program, which is now common. They're all over. This was the first. And I had to explain to the press what a magazine program was. They never heard of it. They'd always seen a program about this or a program about that. Never a program with a little of this and a little of that, like a magazine. You turn the page and you get a different topic. And so I did invent that, for better or worse. And I had a producer named Ted Yates who was a wild man, very bright, very smart, very creative, and he was killed in Jerusalem during a war. And he wasn't Jewish, he was there as a reporter.
In the 67 war? Was he killed in the 67 war? Is that when he was?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was killed at the front door of the the big hotel.
King David Hotel.
King David Hotel. And anyway, most of the ideas were his, because he was, as I say, very creative, and he came up with some really lovely stuff. Nothing like people had seen on television before, because nothing like it had been on before. And it was the first magazine program, and it was the great-grandfather of all of those you see today.
Was there any particular inspiration that made you think of going at this?
Well, I had never worked in film before. I'd never been in Hollywood or any of that. And I began to learn about film and read books, and I bought a camera and learned to run it, film camera. And studied this subject and informed myself. And I found on reading and generally learning that there are an awful lot of good little stories that were not news. That is to say, they were not new, not exciting, not some great development affecting millions of people, but interesting little stories worth maybe 4 or 5 minutes, which news programs couldn't cover. They didn't have that much time to spare. So that's why I came up with the magazine program. And I explained it to the press with some difficulty because nobody understood it. It allows me to give airtime enough all the story needs. Just give it what it needs. You don't have to stretch it longer to fill the time. You don't have to cut it back to fit in the time. You give it the time it needs. And this was new. Now, of course, it's very familiar and happens all the time.
Well, you did a number of important shows in the early 60s. I know maybe Crime Does Pay was one that you did.
Yeah, that was one.
And then you had the one on the Hermit that was interesting. I know there's a...
That's in the Everglades. That was an old goat who lived on a little tiny island out there and never, ever came ashore. It's not much of a story, but it was interesting.
Uh-huh.
And he lived out there in a shack, caught fish, ate them. That's all. Mm-hmm. And we had to wade through the water to get to him. There's no bridge out there.
And you did one on Hiroshima too, the bombing of Japan, the nuclear bombing of Japan.
I did, yeah, showing the horrible destruction.
Do you remember much about your interview, the famous interview with Newton Minow? That was an important program too on the journal, David Brinkley's journal.
Well, it was he who will recall, who was chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, described television as a vast wasteland. Mm-hmm. I mean, that term entered the language from his lips. And he and I were good friends. He and his wife and my wife were good friends. So I asked him to come on here and tell me what he thought we should do. He's so damn smart. And I put it just that way. He came. He's a wonderful guy. I love him. He's now a lawyer in Chicago, I think. And said to him, I'm aware of all of the shortcomings that you have pointed out. I'm also aware that we have to, television is not free. You have to buy cameras, you have to pay people, you need money. So you have to put on commercials. There's nowhere else to get it. Unless, of course, you want the British system, which is not very good. And the BBC is good, but that's all. And I don't remember much of what we said now, but I did put him on the air and let him state his complaints, and I tried to answer them.
Mm-hmm.
And it made a kind of interesting program about which I can now remember nothing.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was a good chance, though, to get him to offer some other alternative to
Yeah.
what he was saying.
Yeah.
Why was the program canceled? It was an important program. David Brinkley.
I think that's when Huntley Brinkley started.
Well, no,
Isn't
no. You started with Huntley in '56, and then your journal was in the early '60s, and you were on. You had that journal, this first news magazine, for a few years in the early '60s, and then it was canceled. Was it? You just don't have a memory of the reasons. These things come and go, obviously.
No.
Okay. Well, this is also the time, of course, of the Kennedy administration, when you were doing the David Brinkley's journal. What was your impression of John F. Kennedy?
I liked him. I knew him fairly well. I was aware of his faults, which are numerous, flaws, which are numerous.
You were aware at the time of the flaws that have come to light since.
Everyone was. And to this day, people have asked me 30 times, why did you expose all of Clinton's private affairs and did not expose Kennedy's? I still don't have a good answer. Simply was not done in Kennedy's time, and it was done in Clinton's time. When you say was done, what does that mean? It's very hard to say. The social climate had changed. I don't know why. X movies had become available, which should not have changed anything, but apparently it did. In any case, it was a valid complaint, and I could not answer it, and I still can't. All I know for certain is that it became possible to deal with the president's private affairs, shall I say, when in Kennedy's time it was not. We were were not allowed to do it. In fact, even earlier than that, I was not allowed to say on the air the word abortion. Could not use the word. Had to call it an illegal operation. And several other words, now common, were forbidden. The NBC was a grand old company and big and important and so on, Radio Corporation of America. And they were very fastidious and punctilious, and they would not allow any shady language whatsoever. And that included personal, private stuff about presidents ahead of all else.
Well, how do you evaluate Kennedy's presidency outside of his personal life?
I thought he was a breath of fresh air in a very stuffy atmosphere in Washington. He had some good ideas, some new ideas. His family members of his family were friendly, good-natured people, and Susan and I came to know a great many of them. And they had parties, and they invited lots of people, very democratic. And Kennedy's performance as president was foreshortened, of course, by gunfire. But I thought he was, to use a terrible cliche, a breath of fresh air in a stuffy room, which is Washington. And I didn't like everything he did, but no one does.
Of course, one of the great crises that occurred in post-war America was the Cuban Missile Crisis. What are your memories of that as a reporter?
My memories of that are that it was Bobby's show. Bobby Kennedy's show. Right. John Kennedy put up with it, but it was Bobby's performance. It was Bobby who organized this so-called army of exiles. It was he who planned the logistics and so on. Being the president's brother, he had the power to do it. Being Attorney General, he had some legal, thin maybe, legal power. But he didn't know enough about, he didn't call on the army to do the planning and do the landing and to take charge once they were landed. He didn't know how to do it. And it turned into a mess.
And you're talking about the Bay of Pigs?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, what about the missile crisis itself when you were in Washington? Were you involved
Well, we all were. We were kept in the dark for a very long time. And we knew the government was alarmed because the Russians were shipping nuclear warheads to Cuba, where Castro, we assumed, would be very happy to use them against Washington or New York. And it was the great rejoicing when at the last minute the ships carrying them stopped dead in the water and turned back. It was poorly planned. Bobby was over his head. He didn't know how to do it. He didn't call on help. He tried to keep it secret. His enemies would say it's because if it had succeeded, he would want all of the credit himself. It's maybe some truth in that. In any case, it was a fiasco, and it was Bobby's fiasco. And
meaning the Bay of Pigs.
yes,
Again. Yeah, yeah.
That's the only thing Bobby ever did.
Where were you when
He chased Jimmy Hoffa
Where were you when President Kennedy was assassinated?
in my office at NBC.
How do you remember? What do you remember about that?
I remember that I could see Pennsylvania Avenue, and the motorcade was going down Pennsylvania, having picked up Kennedy. I guess they're on the way to Dallas, where they flew, and suddenly, where I was, I couldn't hear the shots. I heard them. I had a television monitor on, and that's where I heard them. I couldn't hear them. I was up in the studio.
I see.
And we had then a young man named Robert McNeil. Name was Robin. He changed it. Who was riding in the back seat of the car behind, second car behind Kennedy's. There was a Kennedy's car, Secret Service, NBC's car with McNeil in it. He heard the shots, didn't know what was going on, but he knew there wasn't supposed to be any shooting around there. Jumped out of the car, was young and agile and wind and limb, ran to, there were very few telephones in Dealey Plaza. He ran to the nearest phone and was lucky enough to grab it first before anybody else could get it. He called NBC in New York. Somebody at NBC in the newsroom said, hold on. They said, this is McNeil in Dallas. Very excited. And somebody in New York said, hold on. Put the phone down and never came back. We tracked him down the next morning and fired him. And I can't imagine the horror of being in that position, the biggest news story of your life, and some fool hangs up on you when there are no other phones available. Merriman Smith, by the way, the United Press, was in a Secret Service car. He was a White House regular, and they all knew him. And the Secret Service had its own telephone in the car. And so he got the news out before we did. It was just a matter of a few seconds, but still, we care about that. And
Well, did CBS beat you on the air?
I assume so, but I couldn't, where I was, I
Right.
couldn't hear them, so I don't know.
Was there, what was the decision making going on as far as getting coverage and getting this has been called television's finest hour, the coverage of the assassination?
I think it probably was, because I think we reassured a population that might have been worried, afraid, might have turned to some kind of violence, might have thought the country was coming apart. Our president has been killed out in the street. I mean, it's such a horrible event. It's only happened once before, and that was in a railroad station, and that was McKinley. And he was killed in the Washington, not in public. And Reagan was shot, but not killed, and he recovered quickly. So it was a once-in-a-lifetime, please God, event, and none of us had ever seen anything like it before. The last shooting, as I say, was McKinley before any of us was born. We didn't know anything about it.
Were you on the air many hours doing that coverage?
Yeah, we all were. The network just took over and stayed for 2 or 3 days, day and night, all night. We thought we were, it was our responsibility to calm the public, to explain to them the president had been shot, yes, perfectly horrible, yes, but the country lives. And there's not going to be any crisis. And I think in doing that, we performed a real service in which we can take some pride. Nobody got excited, nobody shouted, nobody screamed. Everyone did his job under the most crucial circumstances, and everyone did his job and did it well. I was very proud of all of us.
Well, Lyndon Johnson became president of the United States, and you and Huntley covered the 1964 political conventions, of course, and you had astounding ratings in 1964. Your team, you and Huntley, covering the Republican convention in San Francisco. Why do you think that you and Huntley and your NBC team had such amazing ratings in that year that just knocked CBS totally out of the picture? Was there anything different that you were doing in '64, or any innovations that you recall?
No, I think we just did a better job, and I think it was because by then Huntley had been around a while and wasn't brand new on the East Coast. I had seen conventions before. I had made special efforts on my notebook of ad libs. And by then I knew every politician by name and by weakness and everything about everybody. And so the convention essentially was dull at times, nothing happening, speeches nobody listening to. So I was able to fill it in with little facts and figures that were interesting, and it worked well. CBS was very cruel to Walter. They took him off the air, and they replaced him with Roger Mudd and Trout. Mm-hmm. It became the Mudd Trout show, which is neither fair nor decent. They're both good guys. And Huntley's Cronkine's a very good man. He's a friend of mine to this day. And so CBS reacted badly. Mm-hmm. But we did get spectacular ratings. In fact, I think we had an 84 share, which I don't think has ever been reached again.
That's amazing.
Of course, there are many more networks and television stations now than there were then. So the pie is cut up into many smaller parts. But I think we had 84% of the audience.
Well, that was the famous Barry Goldwater convention.
Right.
And the feelings toward the media were pretty against the media.
They hated our guts.
Yeah, what happened in San Francisco?
Well, plenty. For one thing, we all stayed in the Mark Hopkins Hotel, and most of the Goldwater delegates were there. They hated Huntley and me. We were communists, practically. And coming down the elevators in the morning, it would be full of their delegates and the two of us, who, of course, everybody knew who we were by then. And there would be nasty remarks from the back of the elevator. And it got to be quite ugly, threatening. So Huntley and I worked out a little scheme. When we got into the elevator, I would say to him, "Are the security people waiting downstairs?" And he says, "Yes, they're waiting and they are ready." That shut them up. That shut up the hecklers in the back of the elevator. There were no security people, but they didn't know it. Mm-hmm. And
well, that was the convention that Eisenhower also attacked the media.
Exactly. And there were young kids coming from all over, being beaten by Mayor Daley's police.
Well, that was '68.
I know that.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Well, in '64, when Eisenhower attacked the media in the convention.
Sensation-seeking columnists and commentators.
Yes.
I'll never forget that.
But that
we were up
created
in a glass box.
Yes.
Over the convention hall. And they all turned over the chairs and ran over shaking their fists at us up in this box. Mm-hmm. And I was happy to be up there.
Well, Winston Churchill died about this a little later, and NBC, of course, covered that, and I think you were involved in that coverage as well, weren't you? In
Yeah,
Winston Churchill's
the
funeral?
NBC chartered an four-engine airplane, a Constellation. Took out all the seats and put in editing machinery and processing, film processing, in the airplane. The idea being that we would be back in New York ahead of anyone else because it was our airplane and nobody else's, and we would develop the film and edit it on the way, and we'd put it on the air from LaGuardia Airport, or Kennedy, I'm not sure which, and save the hour or so it would take to get it into town, into the RCA building and up to the studio and so on. We just broadcast from the airplane, which we did, and it all worked. Only then did we find out that the BBC had beat us by sending their film to Canada. And the Canadians got it on the air and fed it into the United States before we got there.
Oh, and CBS picked it up?
I guess so. I don't know. I couldn't see what the others are doing. But they did that twice. The Canadian did that twice. Once at Churchill's funeral. And of course, Churchill is British and they are British. We're not. And they felt it was their story. In a way it was. And they were not going to let us Americans steal it from them and put it on the air ahead of them. So once we chartered a fighter plane, a British fighter plane, which can cross the Atlantic very quickly. It got halfway across and lied and said they had fuel problems, had to turn back. That happened twice because they were not willing to let us get there first. And in a way, you don't blame them. Churchill is theirs, not ours.
Why did the Huntley-Brinkley report come to an end?
Why did it end?
Yes.
Huntley died.
Well, did he retire before that though?
He retired and then died.
And then he died. And why did he retire?
He'd had enough. He was newly married. He'd married a weather girl at the Washington station. And he wanted to get back to the West, back to Montana. And I guess by then he'd made enough money. I never knew anything about that. And that's the only reason I ever got from him. I think maybe he was sick and I didn't know it. It may be, I just don't know about that. He didn't live very long. He did some commercials for American Airlines, which got him criticized, but didn't stop him. And he went home with Tippy Stringer, and she still lives out there somewhere, I don't know where.
Well, we need to change the video here, tape.